Welcome to the deep dive. We take the sources you send us and extract the knowledge you need, making you well-informed without the overwhelming effort.
Today, we're tackling a really fascinating set of academic papers. They all critically examine how psychological and therapeutic ideas have become so, well, influential in modern life, shaping everything from our personal understanding to our social institutions.
Yeah, it's a deep well of critical analysis, and we're here to pull out the most insightful and thought-provoking arguments.
Exactly. We know this is a big topic, lots of angles, but our goal is to make it clear and engaging.
To give you those aha moments as we really dig into this critical view of the pervasive influence of psycho expertise. Okay, let's start broad then, looking at the global picture.
What's truly striking, I think, is just how far these psychologically and psychotherapeutically informed views have spread. They've undeniably influenced our daily experiences, how we see ourselves, our relationships.
And even the way our societies are organized, right, on a massive global scale.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it's not exactly a level playing field in terms of where these ideas actually come from, is it? Our sources point out how research from the global Northwest, so primarily the USA and Europe, has historically dominated.
That's right. A lot of the foundational work, the seminal stuff, originated there.
And even now, with globalization and tech making worldwide collaboration possible.
Well, yeah, it could allow for that, but these possibilities run smack into the realities of what the sources call academic capitalism.
Okay, unpack that a bit. What does that mean in practice?
We're talking about the significant sway of, like, Anglophone publishing houses based in the global Northwest,
Hmm.
and the fact that a relatively small number of universities, mostly in that part of the world, heavily influence which academic debates really gain traction.
So it's not just about the ideas themselves, good or bad. It's also about who has the platform, who gets heard.
Exactly. It's about power structures within academia itself.
Right. So it's about more than just the concepts. It's who gets to publish, who sets the agenda. And this leads us, interestingly, to a growing worldwide focus on something we all kind of think about: happiness.
Absolutely. Over the last, say, couple of decades, there's been a really noticeable increase globally in the attention given to happiness, well-being, positivity, within this therapeutic culture.
And it's not just one thing driving this shift.
No, not at all. There are multiple political, economic, ideological forces at play. For example, the way we consume things and even the way we work have become increasingly tied to our emotions, our sense of well-being.
The emotionalization of consumption and labor, as the sources put it,
Precisely. And a major driver in this specific focus on happiness is positive psychology.
which popped up around the year 2000.
Yeah, roughly. Its stated goal was basically to move away from the traditional focus on mental illness, what they call the disease model, and instead study what makes life worth living.
Okay, so connecting this back to the global spread of these CISA disciplines, the example of global mental health seems pretty key here.
It really is illuminating. Now, global mental health isn't some single monolithic thing.
Yeah.
It's a diverse field. You've got local actors, global actors, and also the very influential movement for global mental health.
Right, and their central idea, it's that mental distress is basically a universal human illness found everywhere.
That's the core idea, yes. And their aim is to dramatically increase access to mental health services worldwide. The goal is to scale up these services.
So how does that actually happen? How does something like mental health, which can be understood so differently across cultures, become this global initiative?
Yeah, that's a really important question. It becomes a global project through several interconnected things happening. First, think about universal diagnostic systems using the same labels, like DSM categories, across vastly different contexts.
Okay, so standardizing the language.
Exactly. Then you have global clinical guidelines, like the World Health Organization's MHGAP Intervention Guide. That's designed to be used even by non-specialist healthcare workers.
Making it easier to roll out everywhere.
Right. The WHO also offers online training. Plus, there are global metrics, like the Global Burden of Disease studies, which try to quantify the impact of mental health issues globally.
Hitting numbers on it.
And then you have the involvement of powerful global players, the WHO, the World Bank, the IMF, and we can't ignore the potential profits for the pharmaceutical industry.
Right, that's always a factor.
All these things work together, allowing these mental health constructs to travel the globe. And as they travel, they get adapted by local contexts, but they also transform those contexts in return.
It sounds like a really powerful network promoting this particular way of understanding mental health, but as you said, The sources are critical, it's not seen universally as positive.
Precisely. While some definitely see this global reach as a way to alleviate suffering, maybe reduce poverty, improve well-being,
Hmm.
others raise significant concerns.
What kind of concerns?
Well, critics point to what they call the psychocentric nature of this knowledge,
Psychocentric, meaning?
meaning it tends to prioritize individual-focused solutions over addressing the underlying structural issues. The focus zooms right in on the individual's psychology.
So instead of looking at, say, poverty or inequality.
Exactly. The worry is that this approach individualizes and even pathologizes poverty, framing it as a personal failing rather than a result of systemic problems.
Yeah.
It also, arguably, depoliticizes well-being and distress.
Meaning it pushes the social and political causes into the background.
That's the argument, yes.
And this way of thinking isn't entirely new, is it? The sources trace it back further.
Yeah, they point to historical roots in 19th century colonial science, this
Yeah.
idea of universalizing biological explanations.
How does colonialism fit into this?
Well, what's fascinating and quite disturbing is the connection suggested between the rise of psychotherapy in Europe and the success of colonialism. Psychologically based explanations for dissent or distress among colonized peoples were often more convenient for those in power.
More convenient than, say, admitting the negative impacts of colonial rule itself.
Precisely. More convenient than economic or political analyses. So the argument is that modern Western side disciplines actually developed in part through colonial subjugation and even experimentation on marginalized groups.
Wow, okay, that historical context is heavy. This brings us to the concept of therapeutic politics. The basic understanding is that it's about depoliticization.
Yeah, the common understanding is that therapeutic politics involves framing societal inequalities, maybe the lingering effects of historical injustices, as individual psychopathologies.
So big societal problems become individual mental health issues.
Right. And the implication is that these are then problems solvable through, Western self-management techniques. This effectively remove the political dimension, the need for systemic change.
But the sources suggest it might be a bit more complicated than that, not just depoliticization.
That's right. It's nuanced. The therapeutic era can also create spaces, new languages for people to talk about suffering and injustices that were previously maybe hidden or silenced, things like child abuse, family violence.
Okay, so it can give voice to certain things.
Yes. But then a crucial question arises, especially when we think about the global South. How does this therapeutic framework really help citizens of formerly colonized nations address the ongoing legacies of colonialism, the structural violence they still face?
What kind of restitution is offered for trauma that's directly linked to those historical injustices?
Exactly. Those are the hard questions the sources raise.
It really sounds like there's a deep divide here, not just historically, but even in the research being done today. A north-south divide, they call it.
Absolutely, that persists. And it's closely linked back to those hierarchies in academic systems we talked about, academic capitalism, the dominance of Anglophone publishing.
So the flow of knowledge is unequal. Research from the global north gets a much wider reach.
Generally speaking, yes.
Yeah.
That's a major point in the sources.
Okay, let's shift focus slightly. We've looked at the global spread, the critiques. Now let's explore some key thinkers who've shaped how we understand this therapeutic culture. The sources bring up Philip Reef and his idea of the psychologizers.
Yeah, Reef's argument is pretty provocative. He suggested that these psychologizers, therapists, psychologists, etc., have essentially replaced the spiritualizers, like religious figures, as the central authorities in Western culture.
And he wasn't a fan of this shift.
No, he was very skeptical. He worried about a therapeutic culture centered purely on the self. He drew on Durkheim, the sociologist, who saw religion as vital for regulating both individual desires and societal needs, providing a shared framework.
So Reef saw traditional culture, maybe religion, directing the self outward towards communal goals.
Exactly. Whereas this emerging psychological man was focused inward, on egoistic needs, on personal well-being above all else.
And Reef thought this was unsustainable.
He argued that a therapeutic culture, lacking what he called a sacred order, a shared set of values beyond the individual, was ultimately doomed as a secular backbone for society. He didn't think it could hold things together.
Interesting. And building on this kind of thinking, we have T.J. Jackson Lears and his concept of the therapeutic ethos.
Right. Lears argues there's been a major moral shift. We moved away from, say, a Protestant ethic emphasizing self-denial towards this therapeutic ethos focused on self-realization, primarily through achieving psychic and physical health.
So health becomes the ultimate goal.
Yes, and crucially, it became a secular and individual pursuit, kind of disconnected from older communal or religious frameworks. Lears links this to a modern sense of a fragmented, uncertain self.
He also mentions Goethe's fear of the future being like a giant hospital. That's quite an image.
It is. And Lears expresses concern about this lingering habit of perfectionism, this sort of delusion that deep social problems can be solved simply through individual moral improvement or self-help.
Which anticipates later work on how this ethos got embedded in institutions.
Exactly. While Reef focused more on psychoanalysis, Lears took a broader historical sweep. And that institutionalization became a big focus for scholars in the 1990s.
How so? What did they find?
Well, researchers started investigating how this therapeutic way of thinking had become embedded within the modern state itself. James Holland Jr., for instance, proposed the therapeutic state thesis.
Which argued.
He argued that the American state, facing declining legitimacy from traditional sources like Christianity or Republican liberalism, needed a new justification for its increasing interference in people's lives. And the therapeutic ethos provided that.
Making state interventions seem like it's for our own good, our well-being.
Kinda, yeah. And then Nicholas Rose, drawing on Foucault, looked at this in Great Britain. He argued that psychology emerged as an intimate science,
An intimate science.
meaning a form of expertise about the self that actually enabled people to govern themselves in line with state objectives. This fits with Foucault's idea of governmentality, how power operates not just through force, but through shaping our desires and goals.
There's a real irony that Eva Ilaus points out in all this therapeutic talk, isn't there? A kind of paradox.
Yes, it allows highlights this really interesting effect. The more we locate suffering within the self, the more the self comes to be understood in terms of its problems and predicaments.
So talking about it more actually creates more of it.
That's the paradox she points to. It leads, she argues, to the production of more and more real diseases of the self. By constantly naming, discussing, labeling these predicaments, the therapeutic discourse essentially invites the self to see itself as psychologically troubled.
So rather than solving the problems, it might inadvertently make them seem more prevalent, more real.
That's Elo's concern, yeah. Her conclusion is that clinical psychology offers a system for explaining and rationalizing suffering, much like religion once did, and that raises big questions about its overall cultural impact.
It really sounds like the academic field studying this is still wrestling with these complexities. The sources mention a multifaceted present.
Absolutely. There's no single consensus. And there's a growing recognition, I think, for the need for more attentive empirical studies of specific places, specific contexts, rather than just relying on these big, overarching, often Western-centric theories.
Like Elaine Swan's critique you mentioned about work-life literature lacking context.
Exactly. And the relationship with religion isn't simple either. It's not just psychology replacing religion.
It's more complicated.
Yeah, the therapeutic ethos now coexists, forms new alliances, even within religion. The example given is God as a cosmic therapist, blending psychological language with spiritual beliefs.
And we're seeing more psychology in institutions like schools.
Definitely. A rapid increase in adopting psychological expertise in schools, universities, leading to concepts like therapeutic education.
And more recently, it seems this psychological view of the self has become maybe a political tool again.
Yes, the sources argue that in the late 20th, early 21st centuries, the psychological self was sort of strategically re-emphasized to advance neoliberal politics and help give rise to new therapeutic social movements like the happiness movement, positive psychology.
It's a constant reminder, then, that how we understand ourselves psychologically is always tangled up with bigger social, cultural, economic, historical contexts.
Always. It never exists in a vacuum.
Okay, this leads us to a more theoretical framework for understanding how these ideas about the self develop and spread. Social representation theory.
Right. This theory is interesting because it tries to bridge psychology and sociology. It helps us trace the socio-historical development of concepts like the self. The basic idea is that reality isn't just out there. We actively construct it through shared understanding, shared representations.
Collective ideas that help us make sense of the world.
Exactly. These social representations help a group construct and interpret reality, create shared meaning. The theory talks about two key processes: anchoring and objectification.
Okay, what do those mean?
Anchoring is basically taking a new or unfamiliar idea, like maybe a new psychological concept, and linking it to categories we already understand. It's
Yeah.
about naming and classifying. Objectification is how abstract ideas become more concrete, more tangible, often through images, metaphors, or symbols.
Making the abstract seem real.
Precisely. Through these processes, social representations become embedded in our common sense, shaping how we think and behave.
So the very idea of the self that feels so natural to us now can be seen as a social representation that has evolved over time.
That's the argument. And this framework helps us understand the historical development of therapeutic culture.
The sources propose a hypothetical four-stage model for this development: resonance, anchoring, objectification, and naturalization. Let's walk through those, starting with resonance.
Resonance is that initial stage where a concept starts to feel familiar, starts to align with existing cultural trends. For the modern self, this was linked to the rise of the bourgeoisie, the separation of morality and politics, creating a space for more private ideals about the person.
Okay, so it found fertile ground, then anchoring.
Anchoring involved embedding this idea more firmly. Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke were key here, locating morality within the individual. And the Protestant focus on inner experience, conscience, also helped anchor this inward-looking self.
Shaping the self as this rational, self-regulating, moral being focused on inner thoughts.
Exactly. Then comes objectification. This is where psychology and psychiatry emerge as the sciences of the subject, aiming to scientifically study introspection, consciousness, lived experience.
Then they started creating categories, labels.
Yes, establishing normative frameworks. Psychology became a kind of psychotechnology focused on producing a specific type of normality, the autonomous, self-possessed, happy self. Foucault's technologies of the self practices we use to work on ourselves fit in here too.
Right. And the final stage is naturalization.
Naturalization is when this particular understanding of the self becomes so dominant, so widespread, that it's just taken for granted. It feels natural, obvious. This is heavily influenced by popular psychology, happiness studies, positive psychology, the self-help culture, mindfulness, even health apps.
It just becomes the water we swim in, culturally speaking.
Pretty much, yeah.
Now, all this history and theory leads to a critical look at what the sources call psychocentrism, especially in relation to self-help culture. What are the key features of psychocentrism?
The sources identify several dimensions. Things like reductionism, determinism, essentialism, social myopia, hyper-individualism, and even victim blaming.
And how does self-help often embody these?
Well, a lot of self-help is pretty reductionist, isn't it? It simplifies complex social problems down to individual flaws or mindsets. It promotes responsibilization, the idea that you alone are responsible for fixing your problems.
Which ignores the bigger picture.
Hugely. It neglects the massive role that social factors, poverty, discrimination, lack of resources play in well-being. Personal growth is great, but it can't fix systemic failures.
So self-help often overlooks social harm, inequality.
Generally, yes. While some niche self-help might critique, say, the medical industry, the mainstream stuff mostly ignores social facts like exploitation or racism. It steps into the gap where social support is missing, offering individual fixes.
Promoting those tropes like positivity, gratitude, self-love, resilience.
Exactly. The underlying message is often that your own limitations are the only real barrier to success or happiness. Think positive, be resilient, pull yourself up.
It's like putting a small Band-Aid on a massive societal wound.
That's a good way to put it. And this focus on individual failure is, of course, quite convenient for those in power, as it deflects attention from the need for systemic change, from the responsibilities of authorities.
It reinforces those neoliberal ideas of competitive individuals responsible for their own fate.
Yes, governed by these commodified, depoliticized notions of health and wellness.
This critical lens also applies to the growing global focus on happiness as a measure of progress, something the sources call happiness imperialism. That sounds quite strong.
It is a strong term, used metaphorically. It's not suggesting a simple top-down imposition of Anglo ideas necessarily. It's more complex.
Okay, how so?
It's described as an assemblage, a mix of different things coming together, perceptions of progress, scientific developments like measuring subjective well-being, SWB.
SWB, that's the scientific term for happiness or life satisfaction.
Basically, yes. So you have SWB metrics, statistical tools for governance, local ideologies, global concerns about well-being, all merging The trend is towards governments claiming they want to maximize happiness using these quantitative measures.
And even initiatives that seem different, like Bhutan's gross national happiness or the UAE's happiness agenda.
Even those, the sources argue, often incorporate elements of this broader trend, particularly Western therapeutic ideas and the merriment of SWB. There's an ongoing debate. Are these metrics a genuine shift away from just focusing on GDP, or are they kind of co-option?
Potentially still putting the onus on individuals to be happy, rather than changing the conditions that might cause unhappiness.
That's the critical question, yes.
The sources also trace this current obsession with personal happiness back quite far, connecting it to movements like New Thought and figures like Phineas P. Quimby.
Right. Positive psychology, often presented as new and scientific, actually inherits a lot from these older North American traditions of self-healing and individual flourishing. Quimby, considered the father of New Thought back in the 19th century,
What was his core idea?
his core belief was essentially that happiness and misery are of his own make, that what we believe, that we create, a very strong focus on the power of positive thoughts to shape reality.
Almost like a magical thinking.
Some would certainly call it that.
Hmm.
He was critical of medicine at the time for neglecting the mind, but his focus was squarely on changing beliefs to change outcomes.
And positive psychology, despite its scientific claims,
Shares a deep connection. It brings spirituality and science together, focusing on constructs like gratitude, mindfulness, spirituality itself. Sanja Lyubomirsky, a key figure, defends studying spirituality's link to health and happiness.
so the exercises might seem similar to New Thought, just with different language.
Very similar, the sources argue. The main difference is off of the scientific jargon. The conclusion drawn is that positive psychology is deeply embedded in North American, individualistic, maybe even consumerist values, with a clear spiritual undercurrent.
Another concept tightly linked to positive psychology is resilience. The sources offer a pretty critical take on this, too.
Yeah, they use the story of Alma overcoming hardship to show how tragic stories get reframed around resilience. Initially, resilience just meant, sort of, not showing PTSD symptoms after trauma.
Bouncing back.
Right, but it evolved into something more prescriptive, a set of traits you should acquire.
Yeah.
The U.S. military investing heavily in resilience training for soldiers, led by Martin Seligman, who also developed learned helplessness theory.
That famous experiment with the dogs and the noise.
That's the one. It shows how central resilience has become. It even shifted toward post-traumatic growth, the idea you should not just bounce back, but flourish because of adversity.
But what are the criticisms? It sounds positive on the surface.
Well, critics argue positive psychology and resilience within it can end up serving cutthroat capitalism by identifying who performs well under pressure, who's resistant to capitalism's negative effects. Big companies, foundations, have funded research aiming to boost productivity via well-being.
And the results of things like the military program.
Limited, according to the sources, despite huge investment. Many soldiers remain pessimistic. But the deeper criticisms are more ethical,
Such
as resilience denying the legitimacy of negative feelings, especially those resulting from injustice. It can make suffering seem shameful, like a personal failure. It decontextualizes character, ignoring the situation.
If you're angry about injustice, that's seen as not being resilient enough.
Potentially, yes. The focus is solely on positivity. There are concerns about creating resilient soldiers who might become impervious to harshness, less concerned with justice. It can foster a kind of false consciousness, blaming the individual, ignoring systemic problems.
Ultimately, the critique is that resilience denies the reality of suffering.
That's the sharp end of the argument, yes.
Okay, shifting gears again, the sources look at how stigma is understood now, particularly in the UK context.
Right. Goffman's work from the 60s was foundational, but it's been critiqued for... Yes, the sources argue stigma can serve the powerful. Tyler suggests neoliberalism is fueled by the crafting of stigma. Think about how excluding groups by painting them as moral outcasts works.
What about the brain disease model of mental illness? Does that reduce stigma?
It's complicated. It might remove moral blame, but some worry it could also justify coercion, because if it's just biology, maybe the person isn't responsible for their actions. This contrasts with libertarian models demanding full rights and responsibility.
The Halloween costume controversy in the UK seems like a concrete example of these debates playing out.
Definitely. Selling mental patient costumes caused huge outrage from campaigners, charities, politicians, arguing it perpetuated harmful stereotypes. The stores pulled them, apologized.
But the sources offer a critical perspective on that outrage.
Yes, suggesting it was maybe disproportionate and had concerning aspects. They point out attitudes have been improving generally. And they note the hypocrisy of some who expressed outrage but had supported policies linking mental illness and violence, like community treatment orders.
So the underlying distrust within official bodies might be a bigger issue than a costume.
That's the argument made that the deeper institutional biases are perhaps more worrying.
Awareness campaigns like Time to Change are also mentioned as trying to challenge stigma.
Right, that's become a common strategy.
Okay, final major topic, ADHD. The sources take a controversial stance here, suggesting it's not just a biological disorder, but maybe a symptom of the times.
Exactly. The standard view in the DSM-5, etc., is biomedical, a brain-based mental disorder. But these sources propose reconsidering it as a social pathology, reflecting issues in society itself.
They question the scientific basis.
They argue the validity of the diagnosis is lacking, despite its widespread acceptance. The genetic evidence is weak family patterns don't automatically mean genetics. They suggest scientific practices, diagnostic loops, societal approval, and pharma interests all contribute to the perception of strong evidence. The role of key opinion leaders, funded by pharma, is also highlighted.
So the behaviors labeled ADHD might reflect how society functions or how people cope with it.
That's the core idea. Like depression or anxiety, maybe ADHD is a disease of society, linked to what Byung-Chul Han calls the excess of positivity in our neoliberal achievement society.
Excess of positivity, not just being optimistic.
No, it's more about a relentless drive for performance, flexibility, flow, constant stimulation, the I like it standard, potentially lacking healthy negativity, limits, critical judgment. ADHD, they argue, links to both this excess and how the problem gets naturalized as biological.
They use that farmer versus hunter metaphor.
Yes, contrasting defensive diseases of the 20th century, like infections, with expansive boundary-dissolving diseases of the 21st, like hyperactivity. Linked to a borderless consumer tourist lifestyle, multitasking, constant activity, seeking instant gratification, which kind of mirrors the ADHD style.
And this impacts kids in school.
Big time. The romantic idea of letting kids' talents unfold clashes with standardized testing. Kids who don't fit get diagnosed. Reliance on tablets for quick entertainment might hinder developing attention skills needed for slower school tasks.
The hunter seeking quick info online versus the farmer cultivating knowledge slowly.
Exactly. The contradictions between internet nomadism and the need for stability, between playfulness and standardized performance,
Yeah.
it all creates pressure.
And there's a new pressure to be happy, too. The I can be happy superego.
Right, contrasting with Freud's I must avoid guilt. Now, happiness feels like a duty in this hyperactive entertainment society. Tech shortens attention spans, making school seem boring. Less outdoor play affects executive functions, pushing developmental timetables. Parental pressure adds stress.
So the argument boils down to ADHD is a disease of this positivity-driven performance society. Labeling it biological naturalizes social effects, shifting responsibility away from society.
That's the core argument. The evidence for a discrete clinical entity is weak, they say. It's better seen as a normative condition linked to the distress of modern positivity, shaped by life circumstances more than biology. Equating problem with disease is part of that naturalization.
Wow, okay. The final area is the popularization of mindfulness and what's termed the psychological imagination.
Right. Mindfulness, rooted in Buddhism, is huge now in Western psychology and pop culture. Its rise shows how successful popular psychological ideas have become in explaining social problems, arguably eclipsing the role envisioned for social sciences.
The sources contrast this with C. Wright Mills' sociological imagination. What's the difference?
Mills urged us to connect personal troubles to public issues, to see the interplay of biography, history, and social structure. The psychological imagination, in contrast, tends to individualize social problems.
Reducing public issues to private trouble solvable by the individual.
Exactly. It leans towards psychologism explaining social phenomena, mainly through individual psychology, often downplaying or ignoring social structure. Think of John Kabat-Zinn popularizing mindfulness for stress reduction. The focus is inward.
So, popular mindfulness often involves individualizing problems, emphasizing scientific expertise, sometimes prematurely, and promoting specific programs.
Those are key features highlighted. The psychological imagination sees problems stemming from individual psychological flaws or disconnects from some imagined natural state rather than from historical or structural forces, which was Mill's emphasis.
Mills was also skeptical of bureaucracy and relying on funders.
Yes, he worried it could compromise research questions. He saw social science aligned with Enlightenment values of freedom and reason. The psychological imagination often aligns more with therapeutic ideals, well-being, safety, feeling good.
So Kabat-Zinn's focus is inward freedom, being at home in our skin, while Mills looked outward at social structures.
That's the contrast drawn. The psychological imagination prioritizes individual solutions and therapeutic goals over the broader social and structural analysis Mills championed.
This has been an incredibly insightful deep dive. Seriously, we've covered a huge amount of ground: the global reach of therapeutic thinking, sharp critiques of happiness, resilience, stigma, ADHD, this whole psychological imagination.
Absolutely. It's really clear that the relationship between psychology, therapeutic culture, and modern society is just deeply ingrained, incredibly multifaceted. It's got these historical roots and massive social, political, economic implications that, well, we probably all need to think more critically about.
Yeah. So for you, our listener, we leave you with this thought to chew on. Consider the extent to which your own understanding of personal well being, of societal problems, maybe even your own sense of self, has been shaped by these psychological and therapeutic lenses we've unpacked today.
What might be some of the benefits? Sure. But also, what are the potential drawbacks of this pervasive influence?
And what alternative perspectives, what other ways of seeing these complex issues might be valuable for you to consider moving forward? We really encourage you to keep exploring these important topics and reflect on the critical analyses we've touched on from our sources today.